I know I mentioned that I would like for the questions to be held off to the end, but I mean, if you just want to unmute yourself, I'm curious, what are some of the moral values and core beliefs held in America? Anybody can feel free to chime in.
I believe that most people have a moral of basically doing no harm. I think most people are kind and most people do not want to cause harm to people. And it looks like in the chat, to have as much choice as possible, to be ethical, to be self-sufficient, high loyalty to America, we cannot speak, strong work ethic. Oh, sorry. It's saying they can't speak. Oh, I'm so funny. Sorry about that, Mark. Yeah, so it's probably the webinar. Sorry about that, you guys.
That's okay. That's okay. This works. My bad, guys.
No, I didn't know that either. So sorry about that. I thought it was a comment.
We cannot speak. I'm like, tell me more, please. Strong work ethic. So a moral compass of doing no harm, especially in the medical profession. We try to be ethical. We're loyal to America. What else was listed, Debbie?
Let's see here. We had honesty. Lazy people are undeserving. Okay. Service to nation. Everybody is created equal. Freedom, patriotism. Hard work gets you the things you want in life. Another freedom. Having as much choice as possible, being self-sufficient, loyalty to America, a strong work ethic, be independent. That's a good one.
Independent, awesome.
Multiculturalism, individuality, right to firearms, freedom of choice, certain rights such as freedom of speech. I'm gonna guess we have a lot of veterans on here. I love it. Be responsible for your actions and behavior. I love that. That everyone should be able to just live healthy and provide for their family. All veterans should be taken care of. Wow, I love all of those. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Oh my gosh, I think I've inspired some people.
Right? I know, goodness gracious. I'm like,
we just got started 10 minutes in, right? And we're already, talking about what drives America, right? Like we're talking about, again, what the fabric of our nation, right? So these are really, really great responses. I think some of the things that I notice about these responses is some of them are a little bit black and white, right? They're kind of like an all or nothing, right? We don't care about people. Lazy people are undeserving, or you must be self-sufficient, or hard work pays off, right? And so I bring this up because as we get into this discussion, I think we'll see how these sort of belief systems become part of the moral injury, right, that we're discussing. So our objectives today are to be able to define moral injury and understand how it differs from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, analyze the psychological and physical impact of moral injury, including its ability to cause suicide on the lives of individual veterans, participate in some Socratic seminar discussing the relationship between moral injury and the just war theory. Perhaps we'll get to that one. And then I'm going to ask you guys to consider writing a one-page letter to a veteran's family, elected official, or mental health professional administrator in the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, explaining moral injury and providing recommendations for effective treatment. Just some food for thought, right? So a little bit more about me. Like I mentioned, I am an Army veteran. I joined in 2010, actually, I'm sorry. 2010, after my husband at the time made the decision to join as well. So it was 2009 the recession hit hard and there were not a lot of jobs out there, right? And he was a plumber, new construction. We had tried to move out of state and, started beginning somewhere else where maybe it was more affordable. That didn't work out. There were really no jobs. Again, it wasn't just plumbing that was hit hard. It was the economy in general. So he decides to join the Army. He leaves in January of 2009, and then is gone away from our family in South Carolina up until about, I want to say March. When we went to visit him, it was the first time. I was almost 30 years old, first time I'd ever been on an airplane with my one child, my one daughter. We went to visit him, stayed for the weekend, came back home. He then went to AIT, which is called Advanced Individual Training. He was gone for another 4 months. After the graduation from that, my family and I drove to South Carolina, the entire family at this point, vacationed a little bit, took a road trip back through, Nebraska and Colorado, and stopped and did the whole family tour to come back to Arizona, where he served as a recruiter. I think it was a recruiter for about a month before getting orders or being sent over to South Korea. So actually, before he came home, and I think maybe halfway through AIT, Advanced Individual Training, he was given the orders that he was going to South Korea, which was quite a shock to our family. I think we had asked for, of course, the three choices were, the wish list items were somewhere, Fort Huachuca down in, southern Arizona. I think maybe we'd asked for Virginia, and the other, like, out of the country location was we wanted Hawaii or Italy, maybe, right? Not Korea. So, what I thought initially was, oh my gosh, like, what's this look like? A whole nother year of us being separated. How are we going to get through this? Et cetera, et cetera. And I'd heard that families could possibly join their service member in Korea. So I immediately went to Luke Air Force Base and found out what the process for that was. I was told families don't go to South Korea. It's impossible. There was a lot of barriers with regards to what I was hoping to accomplish. And ultimately, I did. I got command sponsorship. Me and our 3 children, we went through what's called Exceptional Family Member Program because my son had a diagnosis of attention deficit disorder. We had to make sure that they had the providers over there for that. We got passport photos. I packed our furniture. We had non-temp storage. I was working at the same time as going through all of this and also going to school. So fast forward, just after Christmas, we joined him in South Korea, and we find, housing and get settled in and things like that. And I start to realize that, I need to work. I need to do something, right? And so that I get involved in the Army Family Action Plan. I get involved in the FRG, the family readiness groups. I do all of these things that really, military spouses are supposed to do, possibly. And he and I start to experience problems. We'd been apart for an entire year, obviously, and now here we are in a foreign country, 3 young children. I'm bored out of my mind, and obviously other situations that arise, and we consider getting a divorce, which then led me to deciding, what, I love this military life, I want to join. So I ended up joining in November of that year and didn't leave until April of the following year, is what was called the delayed entry program. In that time frame, we reconciled. I still continued to make the decision to go. I had picked my job. I took my ASVAB, all that kind of stuff. And I had decided to be a behavioral health technician. So that was sort of sold to me as a therapist in the Army, right? And I was really excited and incredibly terrified. Once the days, before leaving my family in Korea to then go to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, were full of anxiety and stress and maybe a little bit of remorse, things of that nature. Did I make the right decision, etc. So fast forward to leaving and being at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. From the word go, the indoctrination starts. You're put in these bays with, other females. You can see us all here. We have bunk beds. And, essentially we have to wait for enough females to show up for us to begin our training, right? And so I think we were here for probably about a week before our actual basic training started, which was 9 weeks long at that time. So I left in April. It was kind of cold outside at first, and then it just got real hot in Oklahoma. And so I wanted to share with you one specific story that really stood out to me. A couple of things that really still stand out to me with regard to moral injury, but one specific story, behavioral health technician, right? I'm a therapist in the military working under the licensure of other psychologists and social workers and things like that. And I'm standing alongside my battle buddy who, we had to be with somebody at all times. When I first joined in the basic training, we had to find somebody that we were attached at the hip with, right? And so they called that your battle buddy. And I had this drill sergeant, a female drill sergeant, that, sort of presented this question. I don't really remember the context as to why. She said, if you and your battle buddy are standing side by side and you're faced with an insurgent, and she's holding a baby, and she's got a gun possibly between you and that, herself and that baby, and it's pointed at you and your battle buddy, and you have to choose whether or not you're going to shoot that woman, and you have to shoot the baby to kill the woman. What are you going to choose? Right? And in that moment, as a mother of 3, I mean, I can only, essentially I was like, I wouldn't kill a baby, right? But you don't know what you're going to do in war, right? You don't know what you're going to do given the situation. But my morals, my ethics, my values, which are life, children, family, all of those kinds of things, said to me that I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. This started to beg the question of, the military teaches us how to kill people, how to sort of objectify, other nations, other cultures, so that it's easier to kill people. They train us in these ways, but do they ever really train us on how to deal with it after the fact? That was sort of a question that I pondered throughout my time in service. So I want to go over sort of some definitions in terms of trauma, right? Having the decision to make in terms of whether or not you would shoot a child to shoot a woman that's obviously, or possibly has a gun on you is a pretty traumatic experience, right? So it says here, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headache or nausea. While these feelings are normal, some people have difficulty moving on with their lives, as according to the American Psychiatry Association. Trauma is a person's emotional response to a distressing experience. Few people can go through life without encountering some kind of trauma, unlike ordinary hardships. Traumatic events tend to be sudden and unpredictable, involve a serious threat to life, like bodily injury or death, and feel beyond a person's control. Most important events are traumatic to the degree that they undermine a person's sense of safety in the world and create a sense of catastrophe. That catastrophe could strike at any time. So the example, parental loss in childhood, auto accidents, physical violence, sexual assault, military combat experience, and unexpected loss of a loved one are commonly traumatic events, according to Psychology Today. So you see here that we have different types of trauma. So I'm sure many of you are providers and are aware of this. But I'll touch on it anyways. Acute trauma reflects intense distress in the immediate aftermath of a one-time event, such as the examples I gave earlier. Chronic trauma can arise from harmful events that are repeated or prolonged. It can develop in a response to persistent bullying, neglect, abuse, obviously war. Complex trauma can arise from experiencing repeated or multiple traumatic events from which there is no possibility of escape. The sense of being trapped is a feature of this experience. I worked with a veteran one time who there was a fire on a ship or submarine or something like that. And this was in residential substance abuse. And they got trapped below deck because the alarms went off, and they essentially had to shut all of the areas, like close off all of the areas, and he was trapped. So I imagine he had complex trauma, right, as a result of that. Secondary or vicarious trauma arises from exposure to other people's suffering and can strike those in professions that are called on to respond to injury or mayhem, notably physicians, first responders, and law enforcement. Over time, such individuals are at risk for compassion fatigue, whereby they avoid investing emotionally in other people in an attempt to protect themselves from experiencing distress. That's talking about us, right? Like we're called to stand alongside or hold space for folks who have had these types of experiences over and over and over and over again, right? And that's why it's so important that we practice good self-care. The adverse childhood experiences study was a study that showed that many people, have at least 1 to 2 adverse childhood experiences in their life that would qualify as trauma. I remember when I was going through training for cognitive processing therapy, the doctor that taught it was a psychologist, and he said, I never experienced anything traumatic in my life, right? And I was like, really? Are you sure? And and I think like what that says is, trauma is definitely in the eye of the beholder, right? What I see as trauma may not be what somebody else sees as trauma, right? Like that's not the same. Everybody's experience is a little bit different. I think it's based on, personality, it's based on temperament, it's based on the supports that are around you, it's based on your worldview, kind of like we talked about the worldviews earlier. And so trauma, I think, again, is we have these very cookie cutter definitions of them, but realize that trauma, one traumatic experience for one person can, I think, be different for another. So I'm going to talk a little bit about PTSD. We'll define it here. So as a mental health condition that develops following a traumatic event, characterized by intrusive thoughts about the incident, recurrent distress, anxiety, flashback, and avoidance of similar situations. PTSD is what's considered a fear conditioned response. So you can see here I have the criteria listed. The veteran has been exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. You can see that there's a requirement that they have, 1 or more from each of these criterion in terms of intrusive thoughts, avoidance symptoms, and then the continuation of the criteria is the changes in cognition or mood. So, and it's requiring 2 or more, and then of course the arousal or reactivity, hypervigilance. We see sometimes, vets they tend to sit at the corner of the room so that they can have, the entirety of what's going on in their view. So again, these are criteria that are followed by the VA, especially when diagnosing veterans, to make sure that they qualify for certain types of treatment. It is imperative that the veterans that we work with at the VA have this diagnosis in order to participate in CPT, cognitive processing therapy, for PTSD, for prolonged exposure, and also for EMDR. So it says here, symptoms endorsed for 1 month or more and cause clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning, social, occupational, and et cetera. So there's a lot of vets that, these symptoms impact their relationships, their marriages. We have programs at the VA for caregiver support, and a lot of the caregivers kind of struggle with what we talked about earlier with regard to that vicarious trauma, experience compassion fatigue. There's lots of divorce. I don't know the statistics, obviously, but there's lots of divorce among active duty and among veteran populations. They have problems in the workplace. Just recently, I was contacted by Social Security. They were asking if we could come and do a presentation on how to engage a veteran when discussing work-related challenges, right? So that say there is maybe an issue on the job, and they want to be culturally competent with regard to how to address it, and in an effort to avoid, letting the veteran go, like termination. They're trying to figure out better ways to support the veteran in the workplace, because again, we see that post-traumatic stress disorder lends itself to problems with regard to that. Moral injury defined. So back when I first graduated with my master's degree from ASU, I went to work for Aurora Behavioral Health. And it was my first job out of grad school. I was hired because I was a veteran. I say that, you know, I was probably hired for a number of reasons by a woman named Lindsay Gruwell. And she hired me to kind of, there was a vet wing and then maybe a first responder wing or something like that. And she wanted me to kind of be like the point of contact for those two different areas of the hospital. And in that, you know, I got a lot of experience. I got connected with the VA. It's ultimately what led me to working at the VA, which I always knew that I wanted to work for the VA. So I was a care coordinator, a therapist. And then as I was sort of transitioning towards working in the VA, I got in touch with the marketing director. And I was like, she told me that there was a job. And I was like, wow, okay, that sounds really interesting. I would love to sort of learn more about it. And she's like, come on over. So they hired me as a liaison, the military liaison, which then, you know, got me out into the community, got me involved and engaged in a lot of different veteran things, kind of led to where I am now, right? In that process, we did a showing of a film called The Ripple Effect. I don't know if any of you guys remember that. So it was at like Tempe Marketplace. You know, we had this huge showing. It was essentially about a man who had survived a suicide attempt. You know, it was a huge deal. In that, I learned about this film here that I'm going to share with you, or sort of the motivation behind today's presentation, and also just my interest in terms of moral injury. And so the film is called, it's called Almost Sunrise. And I hope that you guys can see and hear it. I'm going to share the video.
You may have to share your sound.
Okay.
I'll share my sound too. Okay, it doesn't give me that option. So just so you know.
How do I do that? Can you hear
If
it?
you, oh, I can hear it.
Okay, great.
It's pretty clear when someone says, I'm going to drop what I'm doing and walk to California from Wisconsin, dealing with something. Like we thought we were fighting for Instagram, democracy, etc.
I remember he called me one night and he said, will you think less of me when I have to kill someone?
It really came to me that I needed to do something now quickly to help myself.
They plan to walk about 2,700 miles. Are you processing any of these memories? Is this helping you? Did he pick?
One of my personal goals is to be a better dad and a better husband.
You have to grab that power, say, I choose to learn from this.
And so meeting a lot of these new people has helped me maybe like restore some level of faith in people.
Such a beautiful film about this journey that these individuals took to sort of figure out what was going on with them, right? They had been to the VA, they had, you know, maybe gone through the process of being screened for post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe they didn't get diagnosed, right? But they had become disenchanted with whatever level of care that they were getting, right? And it was just missing the mark. So they went on this journey. And again, so their definition of moral injury is a wound to the soul caused by participation in events that violate one's deeply held sense of right and wrong. The VA defines moral injury as in traumatic or unusually stressful circumstances, people may perpetrate, fail to prevent, or witness events that contradict deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. The distressing psychological, behavioral, social, and sometimes spiritual aftermath of exposure to such events is considered a moral injury. A moral injury can occur in response to acting or witnessing behaviors that go against an individual's values and moral beliefs. So I think about this, like I present this definition, you know, alongside discussing post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So like, is there an overlap? How do we know the difference? Is it important to know the difference? Yeah. So, you know, I think one of the reasons I asked the question, I think to myself again, like, why are we thinking of moral injury now? Why is it so prevalent? And it's just so funny because, you know, when Debbie and I discussed doing the CEU, I was like, what am I going to present on? And I just kind of picked out of thin air moral injury, right? Again, I think it was reminiscent of my days in Aurora and remembering this film and really, you know, my experience with PTSD and kind of wanting to branch out and get back into moral injury and learning more about it. But I also think it's because of the state of, you know, our world right now, you know, post COVID, post Black Lives Matter, post all of the post 9/11, post, you know, pulling out last year from the Middle East, you know, under Biden's administration. You know, I think we're now starting to discuss the after effects of what the past, 20 years have brought. So moral injury is a term used to describe the psychological and spiritual pain a person feels when he or she experiences a traumatic event that violates their deeply held moral beliefs. Moral injury incidents might include sexual harassment, assault, domestic violence, or discrimination against someone based on their race, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. So what was once described as burnout in the medical field is now being referred to as moral injury by many researchers. Many veterans are suffering from moral injury due to their wartime experience, and research shows that military spouses of service members with PTSD are also susceptible to moral injury. Moral injury can lead to physical pain, anxiety, depression, and even suicidal ideations. Veteran suicide and homelessness have not been empirically linked to MI, but many researchers believe that it is a factor, especially when you think about like the cognitive distortions that come along with post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury, such as I don't deserve better, I am a monster. The things, again, like the aftermath of witnessing or perhaps perpetuating the things that happened in war. Nurses, psychologists, social workers, and chaplains all play a role in helping people with moral injury. First, one must become educated on MI to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms. So here you can see, it's a bit of a Venn diagram. I wonder, I need to be able to see how, one second, the notes that I have here. All right. Hold on, sorry guys. I have more notes that I can't see. All right, now I can see it, perfect. Ah. All right, so here you can see like sort of a Venn diagram of PTSD versus MI, right? So I had posed the question earlier of why is it important, or can you tell the difference between PTSD and moral injury, right? And here it shows sort of what we see with regards to symptomology for PTSD and moral injury, or outcomes to some degree, right? So I think over here in PTSD, you sort of have symptomology. Over here in moral injury, you sort of have outcomes. And so PTSD, you have there's a typo here, startle reflex, again, that hypervigilance, memory loss, fear, flashbacks. Over here in moral injury, you can see that there is experiences of sorrow, grief, regret, shame, and alienation. And in the middle, between the two of them, you see things such as anger, depression, anxiety, insomnia, nightmares, and self-medication through drugs and alcohol. So PTSD is considered what's a loss of safety, right? And so again, that is that fear-based diagnosis. Whereas moral injury is a loss of trust. And so what's needed in terms of both of these is to restore safety in the areas of PTSD and trust in the areas of moral injury, right? And with regards to this overlap, you also see avoidance, isolation, intrusive thoughts, emotional numbing. Again, those poor relationships that happen. What's needed here in moral injury is to create that trust is forgiveness, meaning making, and like was mentioned in the film, a restoration of humanity. So I asked the question, you guys can type it in the chat, I guess, of why is it important? Why do you think it's important to know the difference between PTSD and moral injury? And Debbie, if you can read the chat, that would be great.
Let's see here. Different ways of addressing it, treatment types. One may need professional treatment. Oh, shoot. They all came in so fast. Treatment approach to understand how to best support the person so that you can better assist them. Assessment for best practices and treatment options. Because someone may be suffering and not meet criteria for PTSD, they will still need treatment. To determine what type of restoration is needed. Moral injury is not a diagnosis. Treatment approach, present differently. The person may blame him or herself more with moral injury than with PTSD.
Excellent. Thank you, Debbie. I appreciate that.
And prevention, adherence to professional code of ethics.
Yeah, definitely. Especially, when we look at moral injury as it's being presented now, the topic or, the statement was made in an earlier slide that, providers are not necessarily seeing burnout. We're seeing moral injury, right? Because we're seeing folks, especially at Aurora, and at the VA, we're seeing people experience homelessness at an incredibly high rate, right? To me, as a social worker, like that's unacceptable, right? That's unacceptable. And then you're exposed to sort of people who see, the homeless population as the underbelly of America. They're just lazy, they're just drug addicts, they're just this, they're just that. But morally, in my value system, people are people, right? And we all deserve a certain level of, respect and dignity and humanity because of that, right? And so for me, that seeing that over and over and over and over and over again creates a moral injury. So great, excellent points. One in particular, I think that was brought up that I think is especially pertinent to today is somebody mentioned they may not meet criteria for PTSD, but they still need treatment, right? So incredible point. Remember I said in order to participate in cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, or prolonged exposure for PTSD, there must be that diagnosis. So, and obviously that eliminates the possibility for that. So great. So here I put why know the difference. I think it helps best understand the trauma they experience. Like we can sort of separate the two, the trauma, and then of course the moral injury that was caused to the spiritual self. Damage left by decisions made in war. We can sort of take a look at that sort of stuff. Moral injury makes it's marked by creating a flawed sense of who you were when you were in harm's way. Somebody mentioned that they may blame themselves more for the outcome. Moral injury, it's important to know that there's a second self, right? Like we can sort of start to explore that shadow work, things like that when we're looking at moral injury. And I think when I think about this second self, like I remember this Native American sort of folklore that was told to me at one point in time that we essentially we all have like two wolves inside of us, right? And one wolf that represents sort of the bad in us and one wolf that represents the good. And if you choose to feed whichever wolf, the bad wolf or the good wolf, like that wolf grows. And so be careful of like what it is that you are, you know, taking into your body, taking into your spirit, taking into your environment. And so, but I think, you know, in this situation, when at war, that second self is very necessary. Again, when posed with the choice between yourself, your battle buddy, and a child, who needs to show up if you're, you know, because your life is valuable too. In civilian life, second self must merge with the present self. So how do we do that? That's important to look at. Moral injury makes it hard to transition from memory to the present. So it can certainly create what we like to call in cognitive processing therapy stuck points. So I'm going to show, oh, I missed part of the video. I'm going to show real quick part of the film. Hold on. So I think there's a section. Hold on a second. Oops, okay. Thanks for your patience.
You know, so it really quantifies the pain and suffering and loss that veterans have gone through. You know, it turns it into a scale.
I'm just not taking it. So I went through like withdrawals and stuff like that. Felt like I had a heartbeat in my brain. And, I was done with medication. It didn't help.
Shutdown is now having a direct effect on many,
including the families of 5 U.S. service members who died over the weekend in Afghanistan. They won't be receiving the normal benefits. One of those affected, a Milwaukee family. 19-year-old Marine Lance Corporal Jeremiah Collins Jr. died Saturday. He was supporting combat operations in Afghanistan's Helmand province. His mother, Shannon, now has to proceed with funeral arrangements, unsure of exactly how she'll pay for it.
for the sacrifice that our kids are making at the age that they're making them, I don't understand how this can be a benefit that's withheld.
The last word that we got from the Department of Defense indicated that Collins died earlier last week, and his cause of death was listed as non-hostile as the investigation into that death continued.
I'm trying to find all I can, every little inch of him that I can. It's been kind of obsessive the last 2 days, so I've got a YouTube channel where I have many of his videos.
Who are you claiming to?
My mom, my grandma, yes, my friend, and my little brother.
Yep. Oh, look at my what else do? You feel like if you stop doing it, then you're letting go already. And I'm not ready to let go. Saying goodbye to my son at the funeral home is probably going to be the hardest thing that I've ever done. I am now torn between all these people who think this poor kid died when he really killed himself. I'm not trying to take anything for my son, but as a mom, I guess I feel like I have to bear some of that burden because people expect that these kids are being killed and they don't realize that they're facing mental demons.
I would find myself off in that deployment world, you know, rethinking these situations, kind of like a reel that just keeps going, and you just kind of like go off into that world constantly, and that you know, that really affects being here in the present moment. Yes.
I don't know if you guys were able to see Debbie just brought to my attention that you maybe weren't able to see the video.
No, just we could hear it and see the words, but no, the screen part was black. I assumed that's the way it was supposed to be. So sorry about that.
Darn it. That's okay. No worries. So I bring this up because, you know, there is this question about, you know, today's topic is the connection between this issue, moral injury and suicide. How does it affect us physically, psychologically, and spiritual? And I'd already asked that question. And physiological and I'm sorry, the psychological and physical impact of moral injury. So again, how do these events influence the way I see myself? And how do these events influence the way I see myself, the world, and the event in and of itself, right? And so when you start to treat people with both PTSD and moral injury, you start to see the overlap. It's pretty incredible. And it was going on in the film itself, it was kind of going on to talk about how this individual, you know, he'd stopped taking the antidepressant medications. You know, he'd stopped doing a lot of the treatment again, because like I said, and as many of you mentioned, like, you know, we're not treating the right thing if we're not, you know, diagnosing or calling it what it is or whatever. And possibly more so than that, do we need to treat both, right? And how can we do that? So the next thing I wanted to discuss was the idea of just war. And so when President Barack Obama accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, he discussed this idea of a just war. And I will share with you guys what that means. And this is just a recording, so you won't have to. I'm so bummed that you didn't get to see the video. Obviously, this is available on Amazon. You can buy it at any.
Yeah, maybe you can put the link in the chat, or we can send it to me and I'll send it to everybody with the certificate.
Absolutely, Debbie. Thank you.
Comes from NPR sponsor Subaru and the 2023 Subaru Forester, featuring standard symmetrical all-wheel drive and award-winning safety technology. The SUV for all you love. Learn more at Subaru.com.
Nothing like ads.
As Reverend Jackson just mentioned, in the president's Nobel acceptance speech, he explored just war theory, a concept that's been debated and mulled over by Cicero, Aquinas, Augustine, John Locke, and in our own time, Michael Walzer. The earliest humans, the president explained, waged war because it was seen as a natural part of life, like floods and famine. But over time, the idea of what war meant changed. Here's an excerpt from the president.
The concept of a just war emerged, suggesting that war is justified only when certain conditions were met. If it is waged as a last resort or in self-defense, if the force used is proportional, and if, whenever possible, civilians are spared from violence.
But judging by these criteria, which wars now are just? Well, one of the seminal works on these questions is Michael Walzer's 1977 book, Just and Unjust Wars. Michael Walzer is a professor.
And so I bring that up, obviously, because, when we're talking about war, right, and what brings us into war, and essentially like what these people come back in terms of their experiences, how do we justify the death and the moral injury and how and the PTSD? How do we justify those things, right? And I think, as Americans, and going back to the earlier statements, that we're loyal to our country, that honesty is important. Patriotism, I know every single day growing up in elementary school, I pledge my allegiance to the flag, right? So President Barack Obama goes on to talk about America is at a crossroads. We must define the nature and scope of this struggle, or else it will define us. We have to be mindful of James Madison's warning that no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Neither I nor any president can promise the total defeat of terror. We will never erase the evil that lies in the hearts of some human beings, nor stamp out every danger to our open society. But what we must do is dismantle networks that pose a direct danger to us, and make it less likely for new groups to gain a foothold, all the while maintaining the freedoms and ideals that we defend. And to define that strategy, we have to make decisions based not on fear, but on hard-earned wisdom that begins with understanding the current threats that we face. President Obama's acceptance speech of the Nobel Peace Prize, he talks about the history of war and how humans have been destructive towards one another throughout time. So the idea of just war suggests that a war is justified only when certain conditions were met, like you heard, if it is weighed as a last resort or in self-defense, if force used is proportional, if whenever possible civilians are spared from violence. The concept of just war is almost kind of always rarely observed, is per the research. So comments about, you guys can put it in the chat if you'd like, is war, or why is it important to consider this idea of just war when working with clients that may be struggling with PTSD or moral injury? And Debbie, you can answer the chat for me, please.
Okay. And we had one statement in the question and answer, or one question. Does "thou shalt not kill" arise after a tour of duty when the patriotic values may fade and moral injury arises?
Right. Those are definitely examples of when our biblical teachings, maybe the foundations of much of what our country was started on, are in question, right? Like there's some cognitive dissonance, which we'll talk about later on, that occurs there. So excellent point.
Let's see. More likelihood of moral injury based on the broader society's acceptance. Example, Vietnam. I'm really enjoying this presentation, as the majority of my clients are veterans. Thank you so much. I love that. To engage the veterans' perception and baseline beliefs. Just war still involves violence to witness. True.
Awesome. Yeah, excellent. Absolutely. Essentially, we have to have a framework, right, to work from. We have to create a more realistic, healthier perspective for the veteran, right? We can't deny that these things happened. We can't deny that what you saw, was what you saw. We can't, I read a book once, it was called The Secret Art of Not Giving an FUCK, right? And it's one of the quotes is, everybody has problems. right? Everybody has problems. And if you say you don't have problems, you are doing one of two things. One of them is you're blaming them on somebody else, or you're denying that they happen or that they exist. Right? We can't deny these things happened. So how do we discuss them? How do we bring them into the light, and take the shame and guilt off of the veteran or the person that's experiencing the moral injury? So truth must coexist with another. So no matter how justified war is, it still leaves essentially a moral injury, right? There is a scarring that occurs. War always promises human tragedy. These again are sort of frameworks and perspectives. War is not always full of glory. This is essentially kind of what in Barack Obama's speech, he talks about. War itself is never glorious. It's this idea of reconciling these two truths, that war must occur, and that peace is hopefully the outcome, right? That we all want peace, but that war must occur, right? So that this cognitive dissonance, these are again like frameworks to work with veterans. War is necessary, and that war is an expression of human folly. These are again things that were taken away from President Barack Obama's speech. Direct effort to task focus on more practical and attainable peace, gradual evaluation of human institution. I don't even know what that one meant. I think I was going through creating slides. That one doesn't ring a bell. So, which brings me to this idea of cognitive dissonance. You know what, I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna show this video. One more quick clip from the video, and then I'll finish up.
I don't see a picture with this one either, just so if there was supposed to be, I'm not sure.
There is, I don't know why it's not
I
showing.
don't know either.
So it's the two guys that are, doing the walk, and they meet up with a native guy who is kind of taking them through an experiential journey to talk about his war experiences.
I have had many friends who served in the military. My father was in the Air Force. One of my good friends, he was a sniper for the Army. He was telling me his first confirmed kill was he was in the back of a vehicle. They were on a freeway. They were shooting back and forth with the insurgents that were behind them. And he firing at them. The bullet went through the car and hit the car behind them. Ended up killing a 9-year-old boy. So that was something that always weighed very heavy on him. And as you know, there are countless stories of these type of things happening. And I know you have your stories. So I'd like to just take a moment. You could think of one thing that still haunts you to this day and sticks with you, and the one thing you carry deep with you.
And he goes through, and then they all sort of describe that incident that sticks with them. And in trauma treatment, we call that the impact, right? The impact event, or the impact event. I'm drawing a blank on what it's called, but essentially they're asked to write an impact statement. How did this event affect you, right? And so when you go through this process of writing the impact statement and then sort of reading it and processing it and things like that, you start to realize like how their worldview was changed, how their perception of themselves was changed based on these impact events. And it's amazing. Like, it's one of the most amazing experiences, and really what inspires me to continue to work with veterans and to learn more about PTSD and moral injury, which, I started to realize in researching this is, I think that cognitive processing therapy in essence is treating both. It's really treating post-traumatic stress disorder and it's treating moral injury. And for those of you that know, CPT identifies the 5 areas that were essentially discussed in that Venn diagram, right? So you have safety, trust, power and control, esteem, and intimacy. So if I'm saying that PTSD is based on safety, the other areas that are identified in CPT, cognitive processing therapy, are all based on moral injury, right? What we see, I think, a lot of times, and what we have to work to reconcile is this idea of cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is a theory that states that our minds go through a process of confusion and logical conflict called cognitive dissonance when faced with new information that conflicts with existing information. We aim to resolve this to return to a state of cognitive equilibrium. So again, when something new, it's called assimilation, right? When new information comes in, we have to figure out how to adjust our worldview to some degree, right? So if we all grow up thinking that the world is a generally safe place, something happens to discredit that, we have to sort of open our minds up to this possibility that, well, it's definitely safe, but sometimes accidents happen, right? So that's a healthier view of trauma. People that develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, essentially develop the worldview as the world is unsafe, right? So example, smoking versus health. Smoking is generally known to be harmful to health, yet people continue to smoke despite this knowledge. It presents a cognitive dissonance for the smoker, who must accept that their behavior contradicts their belief about health and well-being. So the gold standard treatments for at the VA are CPT, EMDR, prolonged exposure, person-centered therapy, DBT, and mindfulness are also being explored. There are some native healers that work at the VA, and this kind of touched on what the man was talking about in the video that you guys were not able to see. There's no one external to you who can change who you are or the things you've experienced. You have to do that work yourself. Healing has to come from you. It's the choice to grab that power and say, I choose to learn from this, gain my power from this, essentially find that resilience. How do you get to the place to make those choices? You know, through time and work. And it must be, vulnerability must be experienced, which is absolutely what I saw in the rooms of treatment. And being aware of and present to what surrounds us and knowing that we are all a part of that, right? Finding that spiritual path. Again, so how are we helping vets, community included? So we have chaplain services at the VA, again, EMDR, Act for Moral Injury, and the Franciscan Renewal Center has a veterans ministry, and they do a program called Healing of Memories. Another point that I sort of wanted to make was in session 4 of CPT, you know, again, going back to that statement I had about how do we work with vets in this. And a big part of it is identifying the level of responsibility. What was your role in the traumatic event? What are the facts about the traumatic event? And so I'll share with you that particular worksheet. And you can see that you kind of help vets or whomever you're working with get to this new way of seeing things, right? So in every event or in events, there are things that are unforeseeable, right? So no way we could have predicted what would have happened. You experience grief and sadness as a result of that. Responsibility, you somehow played a role in the event, but it didn't intend to happen. You experience regret. If it was your fault, you were blameworthy, you intended harm, the intended outcome, that is guilt, right? So these are normal responses to events. So again, say you're driving down the road, a child, you know, runs out in front of you after a ball. The child is actually that's going to be the next one. The unforeseeable, maybe that there was somebody else that hit the child and the child had to go to the hospital. There's grief and sadness that's experienced from that. There's responsibility, right? So you were the one that accidentally hit the child, but you didn't intend to hit the child. And then of course, there's fault and blameworthiness. Like if you intentionally harmed this person, obviously you're guilty, right? So you have, in working with veterans, it's really, or people that have experienced trauma, or, you know, of course, this idea of moral injury, you have to help them to reconcile this, right? Again, it goes back to that denial. Like I did what I did, and now I have to reconcile it, right? Also wanted to share, I was recently on the phone with my daughter who's in high school, and she has been forced to read the most boring book she's ever read. And of course, she's only read 5 chapters of it and decides that she's not going to finish it. And it's The Lord of the Flies. And so the question was asked of her, what's the theme of this book, right? And so she decides to trust Google, and she goes to Google and Googles, what's the theme of Lord of the Flies? And the theme is essentially what came up in Google is there is evil in the world. And for me, like that really hit home with regards to this presentation is there is, right? There is definitely things that are outside of our control. You know, there good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people, you know, and I think, again, we have to figure out ways, you know, the goals of treatment is to find a more sustainable way to see the world. And things that, like the value systems that we discussed earlier, can tend to be very black and white. And the work that we get to do with people is to help them to see through a lens of a balanced perspective. So what can we do? I think, you know, I said, write your letter to a veteran, you know, maybe somebody in your family, expressing gratitude, you know, your understanding of moral injury, however you want to sort of approach this. I think it's important that we continue to get educated about moral injury. Consider the alternative, this as an alternative to PTSD. Meet veterans and clinicians where they are. So another reason why I came to this decision to do this presentation was at the symposium, they talked about moral injury, and there was somebody had come to me and said, yeah, I was shocked to see that there were, hold on a second, stop sharing. I was shocked to see that there are so many providers that had no idea what moral injury was. And so, you know, I really challenge you guys to learn a little bit more about it for your veterans, for your patients, and realistically also for yourself. You know, so thank you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erica. I was looking through here to see if there are more questions. Actually, it'd help if I put my reading glasses on. I like some of the statements. Utilitarian ethics, doing what was necessary and protective. An act is good when its consequences bring the greatest good or happiness to the greatest number of people. Let's see, how does one rectify in themselves the indoctrination to kill others who may or may not be a threat? War makes no sense to me. For example, Erica, you joined the military in order to find a job. Others join with the sole intent to kill in the name of patriotism. I'm not even tell you, that's a you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I find ultimately is people join the military for a variety of reasons, you know, like I mentioned. So 2009, there was the recession that occurred. I mentioned that my husband joined as a direct result of the recession. There was a lot of people that joined during that time frame. There was a huge majority of them that were, you know, in their 30s and 40s. There were waivers that were placed for people because there was, you know, the military sort of does this thing where they allow certain people in, and then because they need people because we're at war, right? But then they also draw back. And they make certain criteria, like you can't have tattoos, or you can't be over a certain age, or you have to have a degree or whatever. And so it's kind of like the needs of the military. And so during that time frame, because they had the recession and we were at war, there were a lot of people that joined for those reasons, right? And they were accepted into the military. I think like that's a self-exploration, you know, journey. If I would encourage you to take a look at, you know, war makes no sense, right? So how do you sort of come to terms with it and work to make sense of it for yourself, especially if you're working with veterans, right? Because if you're as a clinician, it is pretty likely that you will probably work with the veteran population. So.
I like that. Let's see here. I see the veteran comparison with firemen and EMTs and police / undercover police with or without military background and their similar experiences with PTSD and moral injury. Let's see here.
Definitely. And so, as I mentioned, working at Aurora, I worked in the first responder, the veteran wing, was what it was called. And Copper Springs has a similar program. And as I'm out in the community as a liaison, there's a lot of hospitals that are creating sort of a first responder insurance, things of that nature. And in the work that I do, I've come into contact with a lot of firefighters who day in and day out are exposed to things that would cause, I think, moral injury and are essentially what we would identify as trauma, right? So it's really important that we get educated and learn how to identify, again, going back to like, why is it important that we identify whether or not it's moral injury or whether or not it's PTSD. I just came from lunch with a friend she's doing equine therapy, and she told me about a first responder who witnessed a small child die as a result of a horse accident. And he felt responsible for that, right? And so for him, his sort of belief system about himself being a fireman is, I should be able to save everyone.
That's so hard. Oh, that makes me sad.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Someone said gives great insight. I like that. We are way more alike than different. Your example in the beginning, you don't know what you would do until faced with the same situation. That's a great way to approach others, especially those who may have been complicit in what those on the outside consider atrocities, war crimes, etc. I like that. Let's see here. Yes, if anyone is asking, I will send the PDF of the presentation with the CEU certificates. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Very good, very good. Great, great, great. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I'll share the video too. The
oh
film
yes, please. If you send that to me, I'll send those too. I will be able to use this to help some of my clients. Thank you. COVID has created much moral injury for hospital staff and healthcare staff and agencies too. Fire police are first responders for death caused by any means, lots of moral injury. It's good to see moral injury as a CEU opportunity. I went to one training about moral injury 2 years ago and I've seen little training until now. So that's awesome. Great idea. Cool. That looks like all of those.
Awesome.
I am going to, I don't know what I did there. So let's see here. I'm going to share this screen really quick here. And then do you see the QR code, or do you see?
I do.
Okay, perfect. Sometimes I can't tell. It looks like we might have had a couple Q&As. What is the ethical caseload size for counselors with high acuity SMI clients to effectively reduce or manage moral injury? How can we advocate within our work group for best practices? Looks like a lot of research has been done for moral injury and case managers, but not therapists. And then thanks for a great presentation.
That's a great question. And I honestly don't know the answer to that because again, at the VA level, we're not necessarily treating for moral injury. We're still sort of, in the realm of PTSD. I think for my example, I'm also the program manager for the mental health intensive case management program that's held at the VA. And so our caseloads in that SMI population is recommended as 7 to 15. That's your SMI population. I really don't know the answer to the other question, but I'm happy to, if Debbie wants to forward me questions that I didn't get the answers to, find out more and get back to you all.
Oh, cool. Let's see here. One last one. What about the war we fight with each other in the US? War on poverty, war on drugs, etc.
Good point. I mean, and that's, my son and I were having this conversation yesterday. He said, I mentioned the Lord of the Flies reference to him, and he said, Mom, all you have to do is turn on the news, that's there right in front of us every single day. And I again, it's like that bad wolf, good wolf, right? So be careful what it is that you're ingesting, you know, become a part of, you know, the solution. And I think, you know, again, at the height of COVID and when things were going on, you know, with the Black Lives Matter stuff, I read a book, it was called How to Be an Anti-Racist, and it was written by Ibram Kendi.
How to be what? Sorry.
How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Anti-racist. Okay.
And so he talks about, like, essentially, like, if we're not doing something, then we're kind of part of the problem, right? And he mentions that, you know, you don't realize that you're affecting or that you're driving racism forward, or that you're, again, part of the problem until somebody hands you an umbrella and suddenly you're dry, right? So it was like this really great metaphor of like, dang, I gotta do something, you know, I gotta get involved. I have to stay aware. I have to take care of myself. I have to pay attention to the things that I'm ingesting, the social media that I'm paying attention to. I have to fact check stuff. I have to not spread, you know, negativity. And again, I think just getting involved and being the solution. So.
Very true. That's a big one. I always tell when I talk with students, that's one of the big things I always tell them, like, you know, be aware of who you hang around with, because you will go where your friends go, and be aware of what, you know, what you put in because if whatever you put in is what you're going to see coming out. So, you know, you can't be a positive, happy, loving, kind person if, you know, you don't surround yourself with that and you don't take that in. So
Absolutely.
I love it. Awesome. Well, it looks like those were all of our questions. Again, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. My brother's a Marine, and he was in Iraq twice. And so I've heard all of his stories and his, you know, a couple buddies of his that, you know, come around and just thinking about, you know, they talk differently now that they all have kids. So it's kind of fascinating, honestly.
I
Awesome.
think
Well,
in some way, shape, or form, we're all sort of influenced, or there's a veteran in our life, right? So, you know, remember that this could have impacted them. You know, if we're all really, I think, focused on trauma-informed care, and this is another way to look at that. So,
definitely.
thank you guys so much for having me, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Awesome. Have a good one. Bye, everybody. We'll see you next month.